Is this something that we could see happening here, or is this whole notion of the Russian mothers sort of babushkas, is it overplayed and it's not really going to play out in this case because Kursk isn't significant enough?
So it's not overplayed, but the differences are very stark. One of the top searches on the Russian internet today is, how do I send my husband into war? This is the attitude that's so different from what happened in the 1990s in Chechnya, what happened in the 1980s with Afghanistan.
What if this starts beginning to seep more and more into urban centers within Russia?
Critical infrastructure across Russia to sort of have a tit-for-tat retaliation that if you're going to target Ukrainian energy grid, we're going to target yours, right? And you've seen some of that in the surrounding areas around Ukraine, city of Rostov in the east and others. But if you can actually hit the energy grid in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, that will start having an effect. That will start to get people really paying attention because right now they're not feeling this war.
This is The Global Gambit.
Welcome back, everybody. My name is Piotr, and this is The Global Gambit, a podcast where we look at and sort of reimagine the West's place in this ever-changing world and the nexus of geopolitics to the international economy. We've had this guest on before, but I'm very excited to welcome back Dmitri Alperovitch, who is the chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, think tank based in Washington, D.C. We've previously hosted Dmitri to talk about The World on the Brink, his book, and the nexus of, should we say rivalry, the tensions between China and the United States. But somewhere else that Dmitri is very experienced and knowledgeable of is Ukraine. And given developments with Kursk and the visits by Putin likely to Mongolia now, the first place that has the ability to arrest him under the ICC warrant, there's quite a lot to discuss. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. Dmitri, it's good to have you back. How are you?
Thanks. Very good. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So I think the first thing I want to do, we're going to split this conversation into two parts, I think, and to start small and zoom out. But I just want your assessments, really, of the latest developments we're seeing on the Eastern Front in Russia. There's been quite a, sizable, increasingly gaining momentum, I think, on that flank, the line of contact. And then we can turn to Kursk and Ukrainians' perspective on that maybe in a little bit. But what are you seeing? What are you feeling about the Russians in the east of Ukraine at the moment?
Well, I don't think you can discuss one without the other. And this is the really bizarre stage of this war that we're in, that you basically have the two adversaries, Ukraine and Russia, fighting two separate conflicts. Ukraine focusing their most experienced troops and pulling them off the line in the Donbass, where things have not been going very well for them, particularly in the last year or so, to focus on this offensive in Kursk. And they've achieved some tactical successes, gained territory in Russia, took POWs, are now trying to hold that territory as well. And in the Donbass, Putin continues his offensive and is getting closer and closer to being able to take the key logistical hub of the town of Pokrovsk, which is a major railroad junction in the east. And it's not that the Ukrainians have abandoned it, but they've certainly prioritized Kursk over defending Pokrovsk. In fact, took people off that line in defending Pokrovsk. And it's a really fascinating gamble that they're taking, basically indicating that they have they're attaching more importance to trying to take and hold Russian territory versus defending their own in the Donbass. And let's see how it plays out over coming months.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I tend to hold back and ask guests a little later on. But since you've mentioned it, let's just cut to the chase. How much of this is a gamble by the Ukrainians that is perhaps potentially, is it reckless? Is it worth the risk? Because some people look at it as potentially them trying to spread themselves too thinly. The loss of one of their most experienced fighter pilots yesterday shows you that there is obviously always vulnerability on the Ukrainian side. Not that there isn't for the Russians, but how much do you see this as a gamble that's worth doing?
Well, war is never, of course, without risk and without losses. And clearly they thought that the war was not going their way over last year since the failure of the counteroffensive and Russian gains taking the town of Avdiivka that allowed them to advance on Pokrovsk now. and they felt likely that they needed to shake things up, and trying to take Russian territory changes at least the media headlines about the trajectory of this war and what the Ukrainians are able to achieve. So it's not without some positives. How it ends, no one knows, and we'll have to see. It's really a gamble on thinking that Kursk is more strategic than Pokrovsk. And in fact, you're kind of taking the decision to trade one for the other. Not that they want to lose Pokrovsk, but when you're taking resources from the front that is already under a lot of pressure, that may be the result that you're risking. And Zelensky talks about this Kursk operation being an exchange fund. He doesn't really explain what that means, but one might infer that both on the people front, with the POWs that they've captured, hundreds of POWs, that they might be able to exchange for Ukrainian POWs, which is obviously very important, as well as potentially the land. If they can hold this captured territory in Russia, they might be able to, their thinking likely goes, to trade it for some of the Russian-occupied territory. So we'll see how it plays out. It's really hard to predict at the moment.
Indeed, it is. But one of the things that I think is quite interesting, we recently had retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges on, and I was talking about the Kursk incursion, and he was quite particular in sort of saying to me he thinks it's more of an offensive. Do you think that terminology matters in that regard for, say, optics or what the Ukrainians operationally want to do in Kursk or with Kursk, or it doesn't really matter in the long term of the end of the war or whatever happens post-war?
Well, the goals do matter, and it's clearly not a raid, right? This was a division-sized force that entered into Kursk. There were special forces. There were combined arms operations, tactically very, very successful, right? Caught the Russians by surprise. Now, it was against much weaker Russian units that they were facing in the Donbass. It was mostly border guards and conscripts that did not expect to be hit this way by experienced forces. The big question is, can they hold it? And this territory, of course, does not have fortifications. They're trying to build some, deploy minefields, blow some of the bridges across rivers, and prevent the Russians from establishing pontoon bridges across those rivers right now. But if they can hold it, it might be significant, because obviously it's a black mark for Putin to be not in control of Russian territory, right? You look at the trajectory of this war in 2.5 years. We've gone from a rapid operation to try to take Kyiv to now 2.5 years in, enormous losses on the Russian side, certainly, and of course, tragically also on the Ukrainian side, and now Russian territory under occupation. Again, we'll see if it's permanent or temporary, but nevertheless, it's certainly a PR victory. It's a tactical victory. Whether it turns into a strategic success remains to be seen.
And before I come to sort of the Russian perspective a little bit more, and a couple of points about Putin and the FSB, one quick question more about the Ukrainians. Like, what are we learning from the Ukrainian capacity to conduct itself within Kursk? So we've seen that they've opened humanitarian corridors. There's a lot of comparisons being made with how the Russians originally invaded in eastern Ukraine in early February, or in early 2022, right? And that the sort of the training or retraining of NATO, Ukraine in the past 10 years under NATO and Western sort of principles has really sort of raised the professionalism of Ukraine's soldiers and staff. Would you agree with that assessment, or what are you noticing quite notably about how the Ukrainian military has evolved?
Look, I think it's complicated. Again, I don't want to take anything away from the success of this operation, and primarily one of the biggest successes is how they've been able to keep it completely secret, not just from the Russians, but even from the United States and other NATO partners. Everyone was taken by surprise here, and to move a division-sized force with all the equipment and logistics and take it away from the front of the Donbass and not have anyone really pay close attention to that is pretty spectacular, right? And reminds you of the Kharkiv offensive that they performed back in the fall of 2022, where they also took Russians by surprise and captured, or recaptured, I should say, a lot of their territory in the Kharkiv Oblast. But we also have to be cognizant that these are some of their best troops, right? These are not the newly mobilized that they largely threw into the counteroffensive last year. where they were going up against hardened lines, the so-called Surovikin lines that the Russians had built over many months, experienced Russian troops, and this was a very, very different operation, and also division-size operation, not a larger one. So I think it was we have to recognize their success and their professionalism in being able to pull this off, but I'm not sure that it necessarily expands to the entire front or the entire war in terms of what the Ukrainian forces are able to do.
And I think a large portion of that also depends on the Russian side as well. Obviously, we've seen, I think it was the UK Defense Ministry have shared that the Russians have been developing a Kursk Oblast administration, and this idea of a Bars Kursk volunteer unit. Could you, break down a little bit, if you're familiar with this, sort of what this volunteer unit is going to do? This in combination with, I think, the front line is mainly being dealt with by conscripts, whilst the seasoned Russian soldiers are, sticking around in the east of Ukraine. What does this tell us about the Russian response?
Well, ironically, this is actually the old Prigozhin idea that's being resurrected that he tried to organize back in early 2023 to create territorial defense forces that he would train and run. And there was little appetite at the time in the Kremlin for that idea. And now, ironically, post his mutiny, post his death, they're going back to that playbook. Look, it's a really interesting response from Putin with regards to this offensive, because for the most part, he's kind of ignoring it, right? He's not panicking. He's not moving large forces from the Donbass, from this Pokrovsk axis to try to retake this territory. And he's not even sending major conscript units, which he can do legally, into Kursk, because legally it's a murky situation with conscripts. Technically, they're not allowed to be used outside of Russian territory. Now, of course, he's annexed the territory in the Donbass, so he could make the legal case that he could use conscripts there, but politically, at least, he's not willing to go there. So the fighting is done mostly with volunteer forces and the ones that have been mobilized back in September of 2023. But in Kursk, he absolutely can use conscripts, because this is Russian territory, and this is kind of what you have the conscript army for, is to defend Russian territory. He's largely not willing to do that. On a small extent, yes, but not sending major forces into it, and is again trying to do this on the cheap with volunteers in territorial defense units, go up against formidable Ukrainian forces. It doesn't seem like the greatest idea in the world. He's calling it an anti-terror operation, not a major let's defend Mother Russia type of response from him. In many ways trying to downplay it and kind of ignore it for the time being. I think his gamble is Donbass, Pokrovsk is much more strategic. Let me take that first, and then I'll go deal with Kursk later on. Never mind that over 100,000 Russians had been displaced by this invasion from Ukraine, and he doesn't seem to care one bit about it.
Interestingly, because 100,000 Russians, and these are Russians that have been, they've been told by Putin, it's been informed by him over the 25 years he's been in power, more or less, that he is the protector, he is the upholder and defender of Russia on the international stage, of Russia's interests, of its heritage, of its culture and everything. But this offensive, this incursion by the Ukrainians into a very symbolic part of Russia, given the Second World War and just generally history, what do you think Russians are going to be feeling like right now? What does this do to their reputation of Putin as the sort of defender and this one thing that Putin bases his entire sort of relationship with the Russian people is being challenged and undermined quite significantly now?
So I've gotten this question quite a bit in the last couple of weeks from media sources, and the reality is that this question kind of belies the understanding of the Russian psyche. The Russian psyche is such that they never blame the Tsar. The Tsar is always good. It's the boyars, it's the elites around him that are bad, that are making bad decisions, ignoring his directions, are incompetent. And if only the Tsar knew about what was really going on, all of the problems would be solved, right? This goes back through centuries of Russian thinking, that no matter how bad things are, we will never blame the top guy. He's our only defender. He's our only chance for things to be better. We can't psychologically accept that he may be failing us because there's no backup, right? If you accept that, then you sort of go into complete despair, which you don't want to do as a sort of self-protection, self-defense mechanism. So there's not actually a lot of blaming of Putin. There's blaming of the incompetence of the Russian military and some of the people in the Ministry of Defense, but not of Putin. And that's really only constrained to the Kursk Oblast, to the people that have had to leave their houses and be displaced. The rest of the Russia doesn't seem to care. This is a far-flung outpost of the Russian Empire, if you will. This is not Moscow. This is not St. Petersburg. And what happens there, it's never been very important to Russian empires. What happens on the sort of far-flung reaches of its lands. So when you need to, you can use that as an emotional response. Let's go defend Russian land and so forth. But in this particular case, he doesn't seem to want to go there, and as a result, he's not trying to mobilize public opinion to confront this operation.
But isn't that a degree of hubris, a degree of sort of arrogance from Moscow, that sort of it's going to remain relatively contained? I mean, I don't think there's any desire amongst Kyiv to try and take Russia or parts of Russia, right? They just are using this as a bargaining chip or leverage or something in a negotiation scenario, right? But isn't there a degree of hubris in that case from the Russians, that it's not that they're like, it's far away, we don't have to worry about that, they're not going to get that much further in?
Again, this is a big gamble. It's a gamble on the part of the Ukrainians, obviously, and it's a gamble on the part of the Russians and Putin that this is not important, and I'm going to focus on my objectives that I've had for over a year to take these key logistical hubs, first of Dviivka, now Pokrovsk, in order to open up operations across the entire Donbass and finally try to lock it up. And then I'll come back and deal with this little incursion in Kursk. In some ways, this is analogous to what we did in World War II when the Japanese had actually occupied some American territory, far-flung islands in the Pacific, and occupied them throughout most of the war. And we chose not to focus on that. We chose on taking them on in the silent hopping strategy across the Pacific before taking back our own territory. Now, those were small outposts. This is much bigger. So it remains to be seen whether that's a successful strategy or not.
Okay. We recently had Lawrence Friedman, a known British strategist, on the show, and I asked him a little bit about this historical perspective because, from if you look back at the Soviet actions in, say, Afghanistan, in Chechnya, one of the biggest pressure points came from Russian mothers, and this idea that their young men, the conscripts, were being sent into the meat grinder, and sort of they were particularly notable in getting pressuring it, rising the Kremlin to withdraw or to notably draw down at least. Is this something that we could see happening here, or is this whole notion of the Russian mothers sort of babushkas, is it overplayed and it's not really going to play out in this case because Kursk isn't significant enough?
So it's not overplayed, but the differences are very stark, right? So in Afghanistan, you had conscripts fighting the war, which Putin has not wanted to do for the most part in Ukraine, except for that one mobilization wave, which was very unpopular. He did it once. He's been resisting to do it ever since, even though the Russians are facing real shortages of manpower. Secondly, he's not, even when he did that mobilization wave, he's not targeted the major cities, particularly Moscow and St. Petersburg, right? He's focused largely in the far-flung provinces, particularly where you have a lot of ethnic minorities. So if people are unhappy and protesting there, who cares? This is not Moscow and St. Petersburg, right? Which is really the power center of Russia, of Russian Empire, has always been that way. So those are some of the biggest differences between what was happening in Chechnya, what was happening in Afghanistan, and what is happening now. And Putin appreciates that very well. Secondly, as I mentioned, this war is largely fought with volunteers that are signing up. And not only are they signing up, but their families are pushing them to sign up because they're coming from some of the poorest regions in Russia. The opportunities are not great. And the financial benefits of signing up, both the sign-up bonus, the salaries, and the death benefits, are game-changing for many of these families. And, one of the top searches on the Russian internet today is, how do I send my husband into war?
Wow.
This is the attitude that you have from many Russian wives, which, let's face it, do not have, in many cases, very happy marriages, right? The rate of alcoholism across Russia, again, outside of the main areas of Moscow and St. Petersburg, and some of the larger cities, is very, very high. And, when you're dealing with potentially an abusive alcoholic husband who may not even have a job, where you have, significant issues on the family front, maybe lots of kids, they need to be supported. It's a great opportunity to get rid of him, potentially even get a death benefit, right? And create a new opportunity for yourself. So this is the attitude that's so different from what happened in the 1990s in Chechnya, what happened in the 1980s with Afghanistan.
Wow. Okay, that's a very different perspective to what we've heard before. But no, I think the starkness. But okay, so that's quite interesting then. But what about if we start thinking about the urban centres a little bit more? I know Kursk is far away. I appreciate what you said before, but the Snow Revolution of 2012, right? People aren't familiar. It was the West's term given to when many more intelligent parts of the Russian community were standing up to Putin's drafting of the constitution. But what if this starts beginning to seep more and more into urban centres within Russia? Will we start seeing this more and more? Putin has to sit up and take notice. I think you're seeing mini purges. We're not going to see a Stalinist kind of purge, but could this develop, accelerate, deteriorate, whatever word you want to use, if this begins to be more present in the urban centres? Because at the moment it's all about the rural areas, but
Yeah, even the major city of Kursk in the Kursk Oblast is not under any imminent danger, and is fairly far away from the front lines. So you're talking about villages and small towns, really one major small town that the Ukrainians were able to take. So right now it's not causing them much heartache, and Moscow is very far away, so no one in Moscow is overly concerned. Now, the more that these drones, these long-range drones, start flying into Moscow and St. Petersburg, and the more that they are able to carry in terms of payload, and you've seen potentially a much more important announcement coming from Ukraine in the last couple of weeks, which was not just the Kursk Offensive, but the announcement by President Zelensky of the development of these rocket-powered longer-range drones that can carry much bigger weapon payload, munitions payload. That can be very effective, both in terms of hitting Russian military sites, particularly their airfields and the missile and glide bomb storage facilities, as they've been trying to target lately, but also critical infrastructure across Russia, to sort of have a tit-for-tat retaliation that if you're going to target Ukrainian energy grid, we're going to target yours, right? And you've seen some of that in the surrounding areas around Ukraine. City of Rostov in the east and others. But if you can actually hit the energy grid in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, that will start having an effect. That will start to get people really paying attention, because right now they're not feeling this war. We're a long way from that, and it will take quite a lot for that pressure to start building. But the Ukrainians are clearly working towards that. And I think they realize that this is where Putin derives his power. It's not in Kursk, it's not in Siberia, it is in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and you have to start putting pressures on those population centers. Now, they're not going to get there with land forces, certainly not anytime soon, but if they can do long-range strike campaigns against those cities, like Putin has done against Kyiv and Kharkiv and Lviv in Ukraine, that can start to change the dynamic of this war. But you mentioned purges. Putin is not a purges guy, right? He's not a Stalin in that respect. He actually hates firing people. He appreciates loyalty. If you're loyal to him, he will take care of you. This is a compact that he has made with not just the elites, but really the Russian populace and more generally. And even when you've done something so egregious from an incompetence perspective that you have to be replaced, you'll be given a cushy job, right? You'll make sure you'll be taken care of. And to the extent that you're seeing some turmoil right now in the Ministry of Defense in Russia, with a number of arrests for corruption and so forth, I don't think it's actually a campaign that's run by Putin. I think it's the rivalry inside the elites of trying to take advantage of the situation, particularly the FSB, that has always had this hatred of the Ministry of Defense, is now trying to use corruption investigations as an opportunity to put away some of their enemies. And one really interesting episode that is very telling was this exchange that we recently did, this hostage exchange, where we got back the hostages, American and others that have been taken in Russia, and exchanged them for spies and killer, in at least one case a killer, that went back to Russia. And one thing that I noticed in the interview with Yashin, the one of the opposition leaders that was released, is he was saying that when he was put on the plane on the flight to Ankara, they all had FSB officers that were basically guarding them on that flight, right, until they were released into American and German hands. And he was having a conversation with one of these FSB officers that was guarding him, and turns out the guy was a veteran, that he had actually recently returned from Ukraine, where he was fighting, and he was passionately for this war. He felt that this was really critical war for Mother Russia, and he was actually being fairly honest in his assessment in that conversation, one-on-one conversation with Yashin, that things were not necessarily going as well as it could be, that the Ukrainian drones are much better, there's a lot of suffering, and Yashin sort of towards the end of the conversation asked him, well, do you think that there might be some negotiations? Do you think that there's an opportunity to sort of end this horrible conflict? And the guy says, I hope not. And if there are negotiations, it's only because the bastards in the Ministry of Defense are going to betray us and all that we've achieved, right? And this is one person, but I do think there's more prevalent feeling amongst the FSB, this Praetorian Guard, effectively, of Putin, that is much more committed to this cause than a Ministry of Defense, and quite a bit of rivalry with folks in the military.
Well, that is a fascinating story. I mean, and also the hostage releases, the hostage exchange. I mean, Evan Gershkovich is significant when I think that happened. But just a couple more questions on the Russian perspective, and then a couple more on Ukrainians, and then we'll move to more of a sort of bigger picture. But so one of the things that a lot of people reflect on, there's a fantastic video on YouTube from the Imperial War Museum in the UK about sort of what Putin's original intentions were, or methodology of trying to acquire it within that 3-day war and whatever. And it was the idea that the FSB led the initial invasion, right, and then the military would come in and sort of bolster the initial outposts and help with the setting up of the administration and administering of the territories that were captured. What are we seeing in the relationship between the FSB and the defense in their response to Kursk? Is it the FSB that is leading this, largely speaking?
It is.
Defense,
yeah.
Sort of. It is the FSB. Okay. And how are they managing that?
Now,
go ahead.
Now, you have to be putting this in perspective, though, because the Chechnya wars, particularly the second one, was also labeled an anti-terror operation, even though it involved fairly large regular forces, and it was also led by the FSB, at least from a coordination perspective. Obviously, at tactical level, the military was running things on the ground by and large, but the FSB was in charge of identifying key insurgents and assassinating them through various means. So it was very, very deeply involved in that conflict, and at least for now, they're ostensibly in charge here as well. Okay, cool. That's useful to know in the context that basically the Russians haven't really learned anything in the past 2 years about sort of initial responses or efforts. Okay, but then what about the reshuffle, if we want to call it that Putin did earlier this year? We have Andrei Belosov, who is a finance guy, who is now in charge of the economy and trying to turn it into a wartime economy, but he's the defense minister. Gerasimov is still in the picture, but Shoigu's shifted off over to the national security, I believe, position. So what is this telling us about the sort of restructuring Putin has made to the government? And is it a big test, or is it just more illustration of the incompetency at the political as well as the military level? Well, first of all, it underscores that no one really gets fired, right? To people that thought that Shoigu and Gerasimov, certainly after the Prigozhin mutiny, for which they've been largely responsible for, would pay some sort of price for this, they really haven't. Gerasimov is still in his old job and still has to this day confidence of Putin. We'll see if it lasts, but he hasn't been fired despite all the disasters of the last couple of years. Shoigu, yes, gets removed as Minister of Defense, but gets appointed as head of National Security Council. So not exactly an exile position. And Belousov is viewed basically as a competent bureaucrat, and I think that appointment reflects a realization on Putin's of Putin that things are not exactly going swimmingly, and that the Ministry of Defense requires some overhaul. Now, remember, the defense minister is not actually in charge of prosecuting this war. That's the military in wartime, right? So Gerasimov has basically full control of the war strategy. What the ministry is responsible for is equipping and training the force. So in terms of innovations and developments of drones and missiles and the like, and delivering them to the military, that's what Belousov really is going to work on, along obviously with the massive defense industrial base in Russia that is run by other people too. So it's not like he's fully in charge there, but basically he was brought in not necessarily to put the Russian economy on a war footing, because he's not going to be in charge of the Russian economy. In his previous role, he had much more of a direct impact on that than as a Minister of Defense, but really to bring in sort of new thinking, new fresh blood, new innovative ideas to the developments and deployment of the weaponry for the Russian military. At least that's, I think, the hope. But again, Shoigu's, at least for now, is not paying any price for it. Now, a lot of his subordinates that have been left in the Ministry of Defense are now sitting in jail, being targeted by this FSB sprawling investigations into what truly was an unbelievable corruption that was taking place under his patronage in the Ministry of Defense for well over a decade. But will it reach him? I sort of doubt it, because he is one of Putin's legitimate friends, and they vacation together. They've known each other personally for a long, long time. Shoigu is the ultimate survivor. He is the last of the Yeltsin era entourage that has made it to the top of power under Putin era and survived for this long. So, at most, I think he's likely to be sent into an early retirement, but ending up in jail, I sort of doubt it, but we shall see.